Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Petrilli. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. For those of you who haven't been here before, welcome. And those of you tuning in for the first time, welcome. We are an education policy think tank based here in Washington, D.C. We also do on-the-ground work in Ohio. And we're thrilled to be co-hosting this event with Teach Plus. It is so easy in Washington, D.C., and particularly at a think tank, to get cut off from the real world, you might imagine, and especially the real world of what's happening in classrooms and in real schools. And so anytime we have an opportunity to hear directly from teachers who are in there doing the work that is so critically important and giving us feedback on how it's going so that those of us that think about policy and might have some influence over policy can do our jobs better, it's such a great opportunity. We are lucky at Fordham because we do on-the-ground work in Ohio. We actually authorize about 10 charter schools. So we have colleagues who are in the schools every day as well and are trying to make good things happen for kids. But this is something that we just can't ever hear enough from teachers that are doing the work, and so we're so thrilled to be a part of this. So just to welcome you, you'll see me again in about an hour when I moderate the policy panel. But first, let me introduce to you Celine Coggins, who heads Teach Plus. Celine, come on up.
Hi there, thank you all for coming, and thank you all in the online community. We're really excited to be here at Fordham, and thanks, Mike. I founded Teach Plus about 5 years ago. We're a teacher leadership organization. Our theory of change is really that to change the profession and change outcomes for kids, we need teachers to be leaders both on the ground in schools as well as in changing policy. We work with about 700 teachers around the country in 2 leadership programs. The first is our Teaching Policy Fellows program. This is an opportunity for teachers to really dig into policy and advocacy issues that exist both in their communities and nationally. As well as we have our T3 Turnaround Teacher Teams program, which is an opportunity for teachers in select communities to work in schools that are low performing as teams supporting the development of their peers. We also have a network of about 15,000 teachers around the country where we offer opportunities to participate in events, in Common Core training, in writing op-eds, and in social media. Before I go any further, I want to thank Mark Teo, who's our research director at Teach Plus. He led this work. And I want to thank Tammy Hiller, who is our former network coordinator in Los Angeles, who was an important research assistant on the work. So our work in policy serves to create brokering opportunities between teachers and policymakers. When we talk about the work, we often talk about helping teachers to become bilingual and speak the language not just of practice, but also of policy. So this work on testing grew out of an incredibly complex experience we were seeing on the ground in our 6 cities around the country. In each of our cities, there was a frustration that this really serious, complex issue was getting distilled down to a largely rhetorical debate about whether there's too much testing. What we saw with teachers is something that was much more complex and nuanced. So much of our work involves asking the question, where can the voice of teachers influence the direction of decision-making that affects classrooms, but tends to be made far from classrooms? We ask teachers, what do policymakers need to know? And so I want to talk about this research report and set it in context. It's our second big piece of work on testing, and it evolved from the first. The first thing teachers said when we asked what policymakers need to know about testing is that not all tests are created equal. It was a quality issue first, not necessarily a quantity issue. What they talked about was a need to get more worthwhile tests and fewer of the tests that weren't working for them. And I'll give one example that I saw around the country. When we worked with groups of 25 or so teachers, we'd hear one teacher toward the conclusion of the school year say, I just gave the 3rd of our formative assessments. I got the data back right away because the assessment was online. The kids knew they had made more than a year's worth of growth. I was really excited. They were excited. We were crying together. And it was assessment that helped to guide everything that happened in my classroom that year. And oftentimes, you'd see 20 some odd other teachers in the room say, oh my goodness, I have nothing like that. I just have a state test that I give in March, get back the results from the next fall, and I can never do anything to improve my instruction. And so what we did first was we worked with a small group of teachers to build a Yelp-like website where teachers could rate the quality of hundreds of different assessments. And we worked with the NEA to get it out to millions of teachers around the country. It was fascinating. Teachers were able to rank the assessments they gave on 0 to 5 stars, and we were able to develop an agenda that helped to articulate what teachers are looking for in tests. Quite simply, number 1, they need to be aligned to standards. Number 2, capture the learning of students far above and far below grade level. 3, ask complex questions. 4, return data quickly. And 5, connect to the resources that help teachers improve. So that was a really important kind of piece of work by teachers around the country. But it only answered one question. It started to answer a quality question. And these questions about the quantity of tests still persisted. And so we sought to say, okay, so this has to be an interplay. We have to look at both quality and quantity. Let's ask the question, how much testing is happening in American classrooms? And so I want to talk very briefly about our methodology. And I was supposed to have a clicker, and I don't have a clicker. Is there a way to advance the slides? All right, go ahead. So I have a couple of questions, sorry, to frame this and ask of you all first. So just to give kind of a gauge, let's start by asking how much time is typically spent on state and district mandated testing in urban districts across the US. So you all have the opportunity to weigh in, and this will be kind of a guide for our conversation going forward. So the first answer is between 31 and 40%. Second is between 11 and 20%. Third is between 2 and 10%. And the fourth is less than 2%. State and district testing. Okay, so we have no answers at between 31 and 40. Between 11 and 20, 39% of the room, so that was the plurality of the room. Between 2 and 10%, we have 29%, and then less than 2, 32%. So that just gives a gauge of, folks who are fairly well informed in this room are thinking about how much testing goes on. One more. Within the study that we're putting forward, take a guess at how much more testing time is spent in places that are doing the highest amount of testing relative to the lowest amount of testing. So is it 2 times more? Is it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, or 6 times? So answers kind of all over the map. The largest groups were 3 times more and 5 times more, but we saw a little bit of everything. All right. So that's going to be a frame for some of our findings going forward, just to give you a sense of kind of where people in the room were. All right. So the key questions that we asked in this study were the 4 that are up there. Number 1, how much time do students spend on state and district mandated tests in ELA and math at 3 key grade levels? We looked at kindergarten, 3rd grade, and 7th grade. Number 2 is how does test time vary across 12 major urban districts in America? 3rd is how does test time vary between urban districts and the suburban districts that surround them? And then what is the gap between teacher reports of test administration time and then how district calendars report test administration time, and what explains this discrepancy? I want to talk a little bit about the methodology. Thanks. So we studied 32 districts, 12 urban and 20 suburban. This started out as an attempt to gain a better understanding of what was happening in the 6 districts in which we work. So those were the focal districts of this study. And then we had 6 urban comparison districts that we looked at that were geographically representative. For each focal district, we also looked at 3 or 4 surrounding suburban communities and compared test time in the urban district to the suburban. And then when we also, in our focal districts, looked at teacher reports of administration time. And so we had 300 teachers who were spread across those grade levels that we studied. A few notes. This is just state and district mandated tests. There are a whole array of teacher developed tests that happen that we did not study. We only looked at ELA and math, so there are certain other assessments that go on in schools that we did not study, and we only looked at grades K, 3, and 7. So I want to kind of flip back now to the key findings. So these are some of the key findings from the report. Across the 12 urban districts, the average amount of time that students spend on state tests in grades 3 and 7 equals 1.7% of the school year, and substantially less in kindergarten. Second, the variation in test time across urban districts is large, with high test districts spending as much as 5 times as much time on testing as in low test districts. Third, urban districts spend on average more time than their suburban counterparts on testing. Suburban districts in this study average less than 1.3% of the school year on testing. And then number 4, teachers calculate test administration time to be more than double the length that district calendars reported in elementary grades. So I want to go deeper on some of those findings. So this graphic looks at the amount of test time. If you look at what you see here is first kindergarten, where there's about 3.1 hours of testing on average in our districts. Then you move to 3rd grade, and this looks at the green is ELA and the blue is math. Combined, those equal out to about 16.3 hours in 3rd grade, and about 16.9 hours in 7th grade. If you look at kindergarten, if you look at a place like Shelby County, Tennessee, which is where Memphis is, they require no assessments at the district or at the state level for kindergartners. That's in large contrast to a place like Atlanta that requires both state and district testing that totals about 10 hours a year for kindergartners. If you move on to 3rd grade, what you see is in Chicago, where they've just made a whole bunch of their formerly district mandated assessments optional. They now, at the 3rd grade level, only have about 5.1 hours of testing as compared to 25 in Cleveland. If you look at 7th, Chicago, again, comes in at the lowest at 5.1 hours as compared to 25 in Houston. If you look at how this cumulatively adds up from kindergarten to 8th grade, about a difference of 120 hours when you look at a high test district that tests about 160 hours over that period of time to a low test that's only testing about 40 hours during that period of time. Next question is urban versus suburban. As you see in the very early grades, kindergarten and grade 1, there's actually less testing that's required in urban districts, and then that goes up markedly for the kind of mandated testing grades. If we move on to the next one, this talks about the gap between teacher report and what's reported in district calendars. This is the one that has made me very popular among the moms in my daughter's 3rd grade class. So just kind of how can we think about testing beyond what is reported in a district calendar? What we find is that inexperienced test takers like kindergartners take much longer to just the simple act of administering the test takes much longer. It's 3 times more teachers at the kindergarten level report. Teachers at the 3rd grade level report that it takes twice as long to administer tests as what the district calendar reports, and that really evens out substantially by 7th grade. A few points. We looked at this question of the other impacts on instructional time, and I'll leave most of this for the teachers to talk about, but there was huge variation among teachers in who were giving tests that they felt were worthwhile and related to their curriculum versus those who felt like they were giving tests that were disconnected from what they were expected to teach. So sometimes assessments were reported to be done well and be a real important part of instruction. Sometimes they talked about preparation being kind of separate and that there were burdens to administration time that needed to be taken into account. So I'll talk real briefly about some of our policy recommendations, and we can kind of go into more depth during the panel. So number 1, this gives us the opportunity to kind of shift the debate from global to local. Just like there's no typical American student, there's no typical American student experience with testing. There's actually a very wide range. There's a lot of district discretion, and there's a lot of kind of school-based and teacher discretion. Number 2, this gives us an opportunity to work with teachers to streamline testing in high test districts For the first time, looking at these 32 districts, we have a first kind of cut at what would average be in terms of the amount of testing. There are some districts that we found who are way out of whack with what kind of average is. But beyond that, we need to focus on content beyond just time. So really thinking about our tests assessing the things that teachers tell us need to be assessed, higher order thinking skills, computation skills, those types of things. The next one is recognize that some of the test features that teachers value take time, so essays and things like that. Couple more recommendations. Number one, proceed with Common Core implementation, recognizing that long-term gain will exceed short-term pain. Right now, we've got some places that, and my daughter's school happens to be one of them, that are piloting the PARCC and Smarter Balanced assessments while they're still doing their existing state tests. That is, going to create some short-term challenges. And finally, report test time in ways that better reflect teacher reality, especially in the elementary grades. All right, so I'm going to step down and allow the teachers to engage in a conversation with Alex.
Thank you all for being here today. I want to say a special thank you to our teachers, especially Christina and Joe, who somehow managed to get out of Indianapolis despite canceled flights and bad weather. All of our teachers here today, including them and Joseph and Joy, are teaching policy fellows with Teach Plus. That means that they are teachers who have demonstrated effectiveness in the classroom, they work in high poverty schools, and they are part of our 18-month policy fellowship program where they learn about education research, policy, and advocacy, and work collectively with teachers in their community on behalf of policy changes that will benefit students in their community. And they have some really fascinating things to say. I also want to say a huge thank you to Alex Fuentes and Dwight Davis, who are two DC teachers who are with us today, who gamely offered to step in if the Indianapolis flights didn't work out, and I hope you both will participate during the Q&A. So turning to the report, our research found that schools spend less than 2% of time on state and district mandated testing, less than folks in this room expected, and less than I think a lot of people listening and watching expected. Are you surprised? And based on this evidence, what do you think the debate on testing should focus on? Christina, let's start with you.
Sure. So I think what Celine talked about with the teacher perception being higher than the actual recorded time on testing really resonated with me. I used to work in a district where we just dedicated a lot of time to test prep. We had a dedicated period every day that was just about the test. It wasn't an English class, it wasn't a math class, it was 6 tests, which is test prep. We had a lot of practice sessions, a lot of diagnostic tests just for the state test. So it definitely felt like we spent more time on it and that it took away from our instruction, even though it wasn't, just limited to that time that we were actually at the computer or the test book.
In my school and in my district, we spend a tremendous amount of time preparing specifically for the test. I teach in the district which Christina left, and we have a success period. It means success on the state test. You have teachers who are not necessarily math or English content area teachers, teaching test skills and identified high impact standards to the best of their ability for 30 minutes each and every day. So we have a dedicated period for the test. So that drastically expands the time on testing that the students spend. And in addition to that, our professional development is largely driven by how to improve student test scores, and it does not necessarily reflect improving instruction. It's test-taking strategies and marginal ways to improve scores, but does not necessarily lead to conversations around how do we better educate our kids, how do we better demonstrate mastery of standards.
Joseph?
So I actually calculated the amount of time that my students in 4th grade when I was in the classroom actually took to take the assessment. And the percentage that I got was actually double the percentage that was in the report. And so that's important for me because I think I come from a district, Los Angeles Unified, which has a lot of English language learners. And so the test would not mean anything unless the students were provided the opportunity to finish the test. And English language learners and other students, they needed the time and above the amount of minutes that was put forth in the administrative guide to complete the test. Then I could actually take that data and use it to inform my instruction. So it was a bit surprising to me.
And Joy.
The findings were consistent with previous years, but with the implementation of Common Core now, we're starting to have more time where we're implementing writing tests for 3rd grade through 11th grade. So we're having a little bit more time with prepping for our tests.
Great, thank you. So I also want to ask you, how do you see using test time in your classroom so that it's of optimal benefit to your students and your instructional practice?
Yeah, I think that happens when the testing is aligned with what you're teaching at that time. So in my mind, the most helpful tests are going to be the ones that are teacher generated, that really line up with what's being taught that week or in that unit. Those are the ones that we use to refine our instruction a lot. Some of my frustrations came when I was being given district mandated tests that were supposed to measure progress towards a standardized test, but actually didn't align with what was currently happening in the classroom. So the students felt like, this is not fair. We haven't been working on this yet. The teachers are feeling like, man, I can't get the success that my administrators want me to. Everybody feels demoralized rather than it being a picture of what we've actually been focusing on.
And I agree with her. We need more focusing on pre and post testing so we can really measure the growth of the student. We have a lot of students who are reading below grade level. In our district, 60% of our 3rd graders are reading below or at basic reading level. So we need to really focus in on pre and post assessments.
For our state test, results have a very long lag in reporting. So my 8th grade students who will be tested, I won't know the results of that test until the following year when those students are no longer sitting in my classroom. Furthermore, there's no reporting in my state on what standards were shown to be mastered and what weren't. You just get a raw score that says the student has passed or has not passed. And a useful assessment is one that indicates weaknesses and areas of strength and allows the teacher to respond to those and to celebrate things that students did well on, because even some of our lowest students have some strengths that we need to celebrate. So an effective test would indicate those things, and our current state test does not do that.
Joseph, do you have anything to add?
So actually, in contrast to Christina's experience, my district does provide periodic assessments that were that dealt with standards that hadn't been taught yet, but they were the same standards. Specifically, it was an ELA test. It was the same standards 3 times a year. And so it was a little bit stressful, and teachers, had that. We haven't even taught that. But by the time you saw the data from the second assessment, you could see the growth and where you could focus. And then the third one was about a month before the actual state assessment. And so that had a high correlation to how your students would actually do on the end of the year assessment, which back then, because it wasn't something that was instant, we wouldn't find out the results till 3 months later. But I think it was very useful.
Great. So how are the new Common Core assessments different than the tests that you've been using? What do you see on the horizon? Why don't you start, Joseph, since you can speak to SBAC?
In California, we're part of the Smarter Balance Consortium. And so the things that teachers have been sort of wanting all along, not multiple choice tests that don't assess higher order thinking skills or critical thinking, but we want tests that assess those things and 21st century skills. So the big difference between SBAC, which is the Smartest Balance Test, and what we had previously, which was the California Standards Test, is that the assessment items are not all multiple choice. Students will have to write out their responses where they have to explain their thinking. They'll also have to provide and cite evidence from a text or a video. And these tests also are administered through a computer. They're computer adapted. So many of you might have, myself, I've taken the graduate record examination, which is the GRE. it's computer adapted. So that's wonderful because that is specific to each individual student, and you get the feedback right at the end. So all of a sudden, what is usually just a summative assessment also turns into a formative assessment at the end of the year. So there's a big difference, and so I'm really excited.
Joy, what can you tell us about the PARC assessments?
In the state of Tennessee, our schools are going to start piloting the PARC test this spring to get ready for the implementation in the fall. And what we're noticing, it's going to be given twice a year, so in the fall and also in the spring. So it's like a pre and post measurement, which is totally different from the TCAP, which is given one time of year. So that's one positive thing. However, I want to also go back to the development levels of our students, making sure we get those basic skills for their students, because these tests are higher, but we need to make sure they're ready for these type of tests.
And Christina and Joe, I know Indiana is sort of in a unique situation with the assessments. Do you have a sense of what the new Common Core tests are going to be like and how they'll be different?
Well, I think that's still up in the air right now. In some conversations with our state superintendent, I know what she said she would like to see would be tests that have kind of what Joseph was talking about with that adaptive element, where you could have a test bank that includes questions, from K to 12 and even college level questions. And wherever a student is at on the spectrum, they will be able to have questions at their level to get really specific information. Right now, I teach 10th grade English. So if I have a student reading at a 5th grade level, I'm just going to see, okay, they failed 10th grade skills across the board, but I have no idea what they can do, what their strengths are. If I have a student that's far above at the college level, I see, okay, they aced every 10th grade skill, but I actually don't have very specific information about them either. So I think we'd like to do something like that in Indiana, where it is tailored and where we can really measure growth no matter where a student falls on the spectrum of ability.
So we talk a lot about test prep and test prep for students. What is test prep for teachers? Have you experienced this? For example, and I think you spoke a little bit to this, Joe, does your PD relate to testing? And if it is, does it help, or should this be changed?
So an interesting thing that has happened, especially this year in my school, because we were recently rated as a failing school in the middle school level based on state test results, is I've seen how testing can come to completely dominate a school culture. So all of our professional development this year essentially has been tailored to how we can raise our middle school test scores to fix that grade. So it dominates what happens in the school, and not only during professional development time, but we've tried to create after-school programs to help for test preparation and remediation and preparation for the state test. So in terms of preparing teachers, it's sort of the wrong way to do it. We should be preparing our teachers to be great instructors and to do a great job in the classroom. It shouldn't be a focus on, well, how can we make sure we're bubbling things in properly? How can we score points by making sure that students write something that's longer and not necessarily better? So we find all these workarounds that are like, to raise a student score from a 0 to a 1, we just need to get a kid to write anything instead of trying to move from a 3 to a 4. How do you make a kid an excellent writer? We're looking at how can we just make sure they score some more points so our grade goes up, and that's very unfortunate.
And do you think the focus on higher order skills with Common Core is going to help force those kinds of changes, or is that being too optimistic?
From what I understand of Common Core, it would be a much better system than what we have in place. If you are, in order to prepare students for Common Core, you're familiar with what the assessment items look like, and you know the level of thinking required to be successful. I found on our state test often we don't know what it looks like. It's sort of a mystery. We don't know what to look for. We get vague guidance on what will be on it. So in terms of preparing teachers, they need to know exactly what the test will look like and what level of thinking will be required to answer certain items, because right now we're just sort of guessing. So there's a lot of time and energy being invested in test strategies as opposed to actual quality instruction.
I would echo that. I feel like in Indiana, at least, we don't get a lot of very specific guidance on what the standards should look like in practice. Joe actually gave a great example earlier today about what 8th grade Pythagorean theorem looked like, and the way that he had interpreted it from reading the standard turned out to be totally different from the way that it was on the assessment. And I think that's something that happens a lot in our state because we don't have those clear examples like something like Smarter Balance or PARC provides for teachers. So teachers don't even know what the goal is. They're just guessing and doing their best to prepare students for a mystery assessment. And then they don't trust that test because they feel like they can't win.
Joseph, I believe your title in your new job is Common Core Expert. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think
Tell us what you think on
I
this.
think with the smaller, I just attended a training last week where we were actually looking at the different assessment types that make up the Smarter Balance. And so we were looking at how to even write these assessment items. So when I think about sort of test prep for teachers, first of all, I just want to say that it can and never will be a replacement for good first teaching. And then after an assessment, the reteaching that you do for the students that need that extra bit of support, or advancing the students that are already meeting the level of mastery that they already need to meet. So when I think about the 5 schools that I'm going to be working with and helping them to transition into the Common Core, one of the first trainings that we're going to provide as a team is looking at these assessment items and maybe in terms of the difficulty, the level of thinking, as Joe was mentioning. So there's the depth of knowledge, Webb's depth of knowledge, which is sort of like the Bloom's taxonomy, which is sort of the level of thinking that kids will be required to have in order to meet that standard. And so I'm looking forward to, looking at these assessment types, but also having teams of teachers actually write some and getting back to writing formative assessments, which is obviously going to be connected to the units of study that they're planning together. That's, so in terms of test prep, that's what I think about. We've got a clean slate.
So it sounds like there's some hope.
Yes.
Christina, something you mentioned earlier was the difference. It seems like testing is, sort of permeating the culture in all of your communities. But you mentioned the difference in testing culture when you taught in a school that was hitting it out of the park versus a school that was struggling. And so I'm also curious how you see the changes on the horizon in testing, maybe as do you see that as having the same reach into different kinds of schools, or do you still see the disparities?
I think it takes a shift from school leadership, to be honest. I think when you're in a school that is in a failing position, there is a sense of desperation. Like, you want to save your school and you want to, help the school move forward and make progress on the state ratings, which does create this urgency of, okay, we've got to do whatever it takes to move forward, even if that just means, we're doing the very basics to pass the test. So an example that we talked about is our essays on our English 10 end of course assessment get graded in about 20 seconds each. So we, if we tell the kids, you have to have 5 paragraphs, you have to have a good thesis, and you need some transitions with commas, you're probably going to pass the essay because they don't have time to really read it. So unless you have a school culture and school leadership that's saying, that's not the writing that we envision for our students, that requires more, I think it's really easy to just shoot for that minimum because that's what it takes at the state level to get that A rating. The school I'm at now, we do look at everything from the lens of what is the education we want our students to have, and the test is a measure of that. It's not the end goal of their education.
Great. So last question for me, Joy, I'm going to start with you on this one. What do you think students and parents should consider when they think about testing?
Well, going back to the main point is we need to meet children where they are. And a lot of our students are below, so testing is an opportunity to show a measurement. This is where I'm at the beginning of the year, and this is where I want to go towards the end of the year. So they need to feel good about themselves. So a lot of students are scared, and they have test anxiety, so it's our job to make them feel better and to tell them that they can succeed.
Joe?
So the way that testing currently works, it's in the culture I work in, is it's kind of dreaded. It's something we have to do, we're forced to do. And that's the same for administrators, teachers, and students and parents in the district. It's a negative thing. And I think that needs to change, because what testing is an opportunity to show what you know and to show what you don't know, so you know what to work on. And something I've done in my own classroom is sort of change the thinking of my students when it comes to just tests or quizzes I give by not calling them tests or quizzes, but let's look at it as a measurement. Let's see what we know and what we don't and address it that way. And if testing, state testing could be viewed that way by parents and students, I think there'd be a lot more investment in the process. It's an opportunity to demonstrate what you know, but we also have to show that we're going to respond to what you don't know in order for it to be valuable. It has to be a tool of education, not the purpose of education.
Christina?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Joe's saying. I think that is contingent upon us having assessments that provide really specific breakdowns in their feedback rather than just a scale score that says you passed writing or you didn't. We need to know specifically what skills they excelled in and what skills they need more support on. I think when parents can see that, it creates a lot of buy-in.
Yeah, and it goes back to one of the things that was mentioned in the report about teachers. That assessment that is aligned with what they're doing in the classroom is the most important thing. And so, I mean, I want, as Joe was mentioning, I think assessments are just an opportunity for students to see where they're at and where they still need to go. And we all need that. So in life, there's always going to be that, where am I right now and how can I improve? And the end goal is for students to be college and career ready. So assessments that through K through 12 that allow teachers to use the data to help them continue to grow and continuously improve, I think that's the most important thing.
Great, thank you all. Do we have questions? Yes.
Myrna Manslowitz. I represent a number of groups, including the Learning Disabilities Association. I know, Joseph, you spoke a bit about English language learners. We're very concerned and have had many conversations with Park and Smarter Balanced about accommodations provided or not to be provided for kids with disabilities. And I think if the purpose of the test is to ensure that we, as some of you have stated, have good instruction, whatever, I'd just like some comments about how we're going to assess students with learning disabilities and other disabilities and make it fair and useful.
I think portfolio-based assessments is a good tool. In Tennessee, our fine arts departments have a portfolio measurement for the teachers. So they take quantitative and qualitative data from the beginning of the year and towards the end of the year. So you can see the growth of the students. So I think taking a portfolio measurement would be a good piece.
I guess I'm asking more about on these standardized assessments. That's not going to be a portfolio, and those students are going to be tested and are being tested in the same way. So what can we do to ensure that they put their best foot forward?
I would imagine that there's going to be a lot of the same accommodations that at least we have currently in Indiana. We don't have Smarter Balance, so I can't speak to that. But things like extended time, like having a scribe to write your response for you, using a computer if that's, if it's a handwritten test, having somebody read questions that are not reading comprehension.
And then also in my district is in the process of buying a lot of iPads, sort of controversial, and then laptops. We're exploring that, trying to figure out. I have a friend who's in special education. He's actually a Teach Plus Policy Fellow in LA, and he uses the iPads all the time with a lot of success. He's a special ed teacher in middle school. And so providing access equitably to those students as well and making sure they have an opportunity to become familiar and use and practice testing in that environment, I think is important.
Yes.
Your thoughts about states that are moving away from Park and Smarter Balance, that are now considering developing their own tests. Any thoughts about that? Whether that's going to throw a wrench into the works or the view that we should all be using at least the same assessments, so that for comparability reasons and for all kinds of other reasons, is it a good idea for tests to just strike out on their own and develop their own tests?
In the state of Indiana, we had initially adopted the Common Core state standards. They're called the Indiana Common Core state standards, and many of our school districts around the state were proceeding with implementation, and then our state legislature decided to halt that implementation because we wanted to, at the state level, wanted to make our own college and career ready standards, which is a requirement. And I don't think it's a good idea personally. I think the Common Core state standards are the result of a tremendous amount of work and would really elevate instruction, which is their best feature, is that if you're going to prepare students for the tests based on the Common Core state standards, it has to actually improve what happens in the classroom, which is not currently the case in Indiana. And I'm not confident that we could do that in the state of Indiana on our own, develop the type of standards that have been shown to improve instruction. So I think it's very important to have a common measuring stick from state to state, and I regret that we're not proceeding with that fully in Indiana.
How about California?
Well, I think that I agree with Joe. I think that would be a big mistake. I think the thing is that the reason the Common Core was developed in the first place was because a student who left California to go to another state, might have the state that they're at, they could be proficient in that state, where in California they weren't quite proficient. They weren't meeting the benchmarks that were set. And the thing is that the smarter balance assessment that we're piloting this year, and it's going to be in effect next year, really does capture sort of the instructional shifts and the work that was done among a large group of people. And it wasn't the federal government, it was academics. These were benchmarked against Singapore standards and Hong Kong standards. I think it would be a huge mistake because I don't think it will lead kids to being college and career ready. That's the whole point. These were backwards mapped from what the expectations were from professors in ELA and math so that we don't have to do remediation.
I think that our standards are only as good as our assessment. Currently, Indiana's standards prior to the Common Core were rated very highly in terms of their rigor, but as I kind of spoke to our English language arts assessment, I don't think it's very rigorous at all. So for us to truly implement college and career ready standards, we have to have an assessment that is benchmarked at that level that Joseph's talking about.
Alex, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I'm Alex Fuentes, and I just wanted to talk about, respond to the question about students with special needs and also the Common Core. Not necessarily should we all use the same assessment, but the real opportunity that the Common Core presents in the classroom, and it's changing the way that teachers are talking about instruction. And I think it's going to change the way that we're doing instruction in the classroom to help students who have special needs to really improve all learning. If we just take DC as a case study, right, the current DC CAS state assessment is written at an 8th grade reading level. And if we have half of students not proficient on that, that means half our students aren't in 10th grade reading at an 8th grade level, right? It's a tragedy, but what Common Core does is it says that ELA teachers are not the only ones who use reading and writing in our instruction. And it says, as a science teacher in my biology classroom, I have clear standards for how to get students to read more analytically and write more thoughtfully. And those kinds of changes are happening in the way teachers talk. And teachers, even in DC, through Teach Plus, are getting together and talking about, okay, how do we actually change our instruction in a science and a history and a math class so students can learn how to read? And so we need to stick with those assessments because it's a huge shift in what we're doing in the classroom, and it's going to make a huge difference in how our students learn.
Yes.
My name is Ellen Street, and I'm a student at the University of Missouri for TESOL. And I was curious if you guys had any implications that this might have on bilingual learners as they're trying to assimilate into the American society.
So one of the interesting things that Joseph brought up was the additional testing required of English language learners. I mean, so if we look at the time on testing, you can take that and increase it by varying amounts across districts, but increase it for English language learners because they're constantly being benchmarked on their English language skills. So there's a very interesting conversation to be had, I suppose, around are those assessments effective? Are they measuring English language acquisition well? Are they helping ELA teachers or classroom teachers realize the weaknesses of their English language learning students and in a way that they can address those? So, the time on testing is obviously increased for those students. Are those tests working? And I think it's a very important question to ask.
And I think the assessments raised, because they're aligned with the Common Core, they're at the level, they're raising the bar, not just for other students, but for English language learners as well. So literacy is very important. So the foundational skills piece of the Common Core is very strong. So that's the sort of the foundation for English language learners, because if they don't have the literacy skills, and also in terms of oral language development, the speaking and listening standards, there's some smarter balanced assessment items where they're given a task and they actually have to go talk in a small group, and then they go back to writing. So that kind of building of communication skills and collaboration skills, that's solid in the Common Core, and that's assessed on some items. And then for math, there's the mathematical practices. So mathematical practice number 3 talks about critiquing others' reasoning. So not just occurring in ELA, but like in math and science, talk is very important. So that oral language development will help English language learners to progress farther along, and it will improve their writing skills as well.
Wait, did you have a question or comment? And please introduce yourself.
Dwight Davis. I'm also a Teach Plus DC alum. But my question had to do with technological literacy and the park and Smarter Balance. They're going to be online. And so how is that going to impact your ability to prepare students for this assessment? Is that going to demand even more time? What other literacies are necessary? Can you just speak on that?
Well, we're starting our writing test now in the state of Tennessee, and we have time where we're teaching keyboarding skills in the library time, and also telling our parents, you need to also help in preparing our students for the new park, the new Common Core. So it takes everyone, not just the teacher. It takes the community, the parents, the students, and the teacher.
I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I think that maybe that speaks to some of why urban students do spend more time on test prep, is that technological literacy is often not part of our curriculum. But when I hear people raising concerns about, we're going to need to have more computers in our school, we're going to need to teach our students how to type for these upcoming assessments, that's kind of horrifying that it takes a test for us to say that we need computers and to teach students to type in the year 2014. I mean, if that's what it takes to get computers in our school, then I guess I'm glad that we have them.
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I mean, I think the technology constraints, the school I work in, we're very limited in our resources in terms of computer availability. So in preparing for the test and taking diagnostic tests and all the other time we spend in getting ready for the state test, that's one of the things that has to be managed, is that capacity, that technology or lack of capacity. So we have, it's a very difficult thing to do when you have 3 computer labs for hundreds of students and you only have, less than 100 computers. So it's a challenge, certainly. And just sort of another facet of the test that is questionable.
And I would just say in brief that technology skills and integration can't be an afterthought. It has to be integrated within units of study so that students are actually using it as a tool for their learning. If not, I'm not even thinking about the part, but that's the skills that are necessary for students in the 21st century.
Are there any questions from Twitter that we want to ask? Not yet? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
If I may, for all the good things that Park and Common Core and Smarter Balance may bring to the table for reform, I want to know whether, the real controversy out there is how the test scores are going to be used, how the results are going to be used. And one of those is in evaluating teachers. Any thoughts about how test scores moving forward are going to help evaluate the work you do in the classroom?
That's why I feel you have to have a balance of assessments. You need to have qualitative and quantitative data. You need to have pre and post tests so you can have a measurement of growth and not just a test where you give it to them once a year. So every teacher should have their own growth measurement. You need to know if you're helping your students grow within that year, but it has to be balanced.
I think part of the animosity towards the state test Indiana is that it is part of our evaluation by state law. So teachers are scared of the test, and that sort of contributes to the very negative culture around the test, is that teachers know that it will have a direct impact on their evaluation, their job, and there's a lot of concern among my colleagues about the test for that reason, especially since the test is very mysterious. And so teachers don't feel like they can know what level their students need to reach to be successful. So that's part of the negative culture of testing that's been created. I don't think that means that testing should not be part of evaluation. I think it absolutely should. But I think it has to be effective testing and testing that teachers believe in. So one of the recommendations from the report was to involve teachers in the selection of the tests. And I think that would be a very valuable way to create that investment on behalf of teachers and take it from a very negative thing to something that could be positive. It would allow teachers to show what they do every day, kind of a result to point to and say, this is what I accomplished, but that's not the current case in Indiana.
I think it helps, with it being an indicator of teacher effectiveness and part of teacher evaluation, that I think there should be a sort of a period, and I think it should be part of evaluation, but I think there should be a period of transitioning into this and doing it well with teachers at the table, as Joe was mentioning. I think accountability just for accountability's sake is a wrong policy driver. I think this is an opportunity to build up shared collective professional knowledge together. So if there's space to do that, I think there won't be the negative sort of atmosphere around testing and sort of fear. I don't want fear or compliance. I want people to be motivated, and testing's part of that. I want them to be motivated to improve their practice, not just individually, but as a group, because that's where I think we really get sort of the reform and the effects on student achievement that are sustainable.
Tina, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a quality issue. I'm really glad that we have things like assessment advisor and just conversations starting around the quality of assessments. An example I'll give from Indiana is we might get an item sample from our test, and there's 4 or 5 English teachers sitting around a room. We all have master's degrees, highly educated, feel pretty confident that we should be able to pass a 10th grade English test, and we'll come up with 3 different valid answers on this multiple choice question, and we can all give, text-based reasons why we chose that answer. So do I want to be evaluated on the results of that question? No, I don't. That doesn't seem fair. Do I want to be evaluated on a test that doesn't measure growth? Well, if I teach in an inner city school where I'm, bringing kids from well below grade level to still below grade level, but maybe 3 grade levels higher, I would like to have credit for that. And if the current tests don't do that, teachers are not going to trust them and they're not going to be invested in that system.
Dwight, do you have comments on that as a teacher in DCPS who has lived under impact for a few years, one of the pioneering districts? I would love for you to have an opportunity to chime in if you'd like to.
Sure. So I recently had the opportunity to publish a piece in Learning from the Experts. It's a great book. I think everybody should get a copy of it. And so I talked about impact and teaching evaluation. And I really feel like impact is a good thing, because when you look at teacher evaluation before impact, it was very inconsistent. You really didn't know when you were going to be evaluated. You didn't know any there was no criteria that was given to you firsthand to say, hey, this is what you're going to be evaluated on. And so what impact does is it clearly says to teachers, here are the standards that you're going to be evaluated on. Here's what is expected. Here's an exemplar example. Here is a terrible example of teaching. There are videos that you can access, right? And I do think that it has definitely helped my teaching practice, because we have a common language that we can use. So if my principal comes in, he's talking about one particular standard, and my assistant principal comes in, or someone, an independent evaluator comes in, we are all speaking the same language. The difficulty is, and I think the panel discussed this earlier, was that when we take these summative assessments, the data that comes back is not as specific as it needs to be to help me help students grow more. So, for example, when we take the DC CAS, there are generalities. Here's how a child did in informational texts. Here's how a child did in literary text. Here's how a child did in vocabulary. But what I need to know at the beginning of the school year is when we look at standard L54, how did he or she do? Because that will let me know how to better personalize this child's educational experience. And so if the assessments are going to give me more meaningful data, I'm all for it. But if it's just going to speak in generalities, that's not helpful because it takes me at least 2 to 3 months to really figure out, oh, this is the issue that the child has. Right? So I think, impact, I think it's an imperfect, perfect system. And I give DCPS a tremendous amount of credit because each year there's been a new iteration, things change. Initially it was 50% of your evaluation is solely based on students' test scores. Now it's 35% and 15%. You and your principal decide, what your growth measure is going to be. So I think the system is iterating and changing. But I think it's good, but I think you must always have that flexibility built in. Yeah.
I saw some nodding heads up here. We're about at time. Is there a last question, or I want to also give you guys give you a chance for any last parting thoughts?
It was just an additional thought. I'm also a DCPS teacher. I've worked in DCPS as both a teacher and an instructional coach. And being a person whose job it is to be a professional development, to provide professional development in the area of the Common Core has been somewhat of a struggle. And I think back to the question around how we are evaluated, one of the struggles that we have as teachers is also, does an assessment have a growth portion? Like, I'm teaching 5th grade right now, sharing with Dwight. I've moved most of my class about a year, but also of that class, the majority of them are reading below grade level. So are they going to access the assessment? So do the assessments we have measure both standards, grade level standard expectations and growth measures to get a picture of a teacher? I could have a class that came to me 4 years behind. I could grow them to just right where they need to be, and then they all bomb the assessment that's based on their grade level expectations. So then I therefore look like I'm not an effective teacher, but I closed their entire elementary gap by myself. Do you know what I mean? Those kinds of considerations. And I don't think that is just an urban school issue. I think that's a national issue. And then the bigger issue is why do we have children getting to these levels of 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade so far behind? So what value do we put on early childhood education is a whole nother layer. And why isn't that evaluated, or aren't teachers made aware of student growth and readiness when they enter school in the first place?
So are you worried that the Common Core tests that are aligned with Common Core are not going to value you or evaluate you appropriately because you move these kids forward?
No. I'm not worried about implementing the standards. They have raised the quality of my teaching practice. What I'm concerned about is that when there's only one measure, and that measure doesn't give you an entire picture of instruction or growth of students, then that's put us actually in a nation in a very dire place.
And I agree. And the point is, literacy in America is totally going down. And we have teachers who are pre-K through 2nd grade teachers. Phonemic awareness, you really do not have time to teach those early skills because we have going to the computer to do intervention, and we need the face one-on-one time. So having a portfolio like our state has for fine arts, you have qualitative and quantitative data so you can get that credit for growing your students. So literacy is key, and we need to have more information and more dialogue on literacy in America.
Any last thoughts? And then we're going to shift to panel 2.
I just think a very, very big consideration is not necessarily the time on testing. It varies widely across the country, as this report shows, and more testing does not necessarily equal better results. So what we really need to consider is, are our tests improving our schools? Are the tests creating conversations among teachers that are elevating instruction? Are the tests doing what they need to do to make sure student learning is what it needs to be and should be? That's the biggest question we have to ask when looking at assessment.
Very wise last words. Thank you, Joe, and thank you all. Please join me in thanking you. And thank you for all you're doing every day in our classrooms.
We're going to take about a 5-minute break to switch around the panel. We'll get started shortly.
Gosh, me and my hat. Everybody thinks,
And it turns green. Yeah, it's recording.
Where was he? Where
working here? Where are you from? Okay, what part? He's from here. Park Slope. Okay. I'm Thank you very much.
No, I think that's fine. We'll put.
Where am I? Am I on the
Yeah,
left
you
side?
come over here.
Am I on the left again?
I chose the wrong. Can I move?
That's all right. That's tape.
That's
What
it.
does that mean? I just shoot it.
You just talk.
Oh, what the hell is he telling me I got a mic up? I'm pleased with this guy. So you just winging this? Nobody, where are you going to sit? You want me to move one over?
I'm standing. We're going to get started in about a minute. We got plenty of seats. Please use them.
Oh, you got water. I was going to say she wanted water. So I have to press it or anything, or it just picks it up?
No, you just
say hello to the country.
Come on.
They gave you the water.
No, I don't. Oh, I do.
By the way, I'm going to totally go off screen. So just
Do it. That sounds good.
Okay. All right. That was a fantastic panel, wasn't it? Let's thank our teachers one more time for their thoughts, comments. Several of them traveled a long way through much ice and snow to get here to give us that. So that was fantastic. We have one more panel to go until our reception. Now, if you're watching at home, you can go to the beer anytime you want and grab a beer, as we know. If you're on East Coast time, I think, frankly, if you're watching in California, it's a little early, but I'm just saying. But we won't judge. Okay, so the point of this panel is to now talk from the policy wonk perspective about the findings of this study. So you've already met Celine. Everybody knows EduWonk Andy Rotherham. Your title, what's your title? Partner, co-founder and partner, Bellwether Education Partners. And Dave Driscoll, who is the chair of the National Assessment Governing Board, but even more importantly, he is the chair of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute Board, and he's also on the advisory committee, right, of Teach Plus. So you're a twofer, Dave.
Former commissioner of that institute.
Oh, right, and then there was that Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, and then, yes, something about Massachusetts, best state in the country, blah, blah, blah. But we'll get to that. Just okay. You know, people who've been to these events before know that I try to keep it lively because, again, it's 5 o'clock and we're talking about education. So we will do that. All right, so we just heard great comments from the teachers. And I have to say, my own perspective was that it was not exactly a ringing endorsement for the role that testing is playing in today's schools. Yet many of us have been involved in federal and state reforms that have focused a lot on testing and accountability. So let me just start with the big picture question, which is, why don't we just get rid of the state assessments, right? I mean, remind us again, why? I mean, we keep hearing there's all this time spent on testing and all this pressure, and you know, it's not getting teachers to teach in a positive way, and it's destroying our school cultures. You know, are we at a point where we just need to say, hey, throw that out and let's try something else right now? There's plenty of reformers, Jay Green, for example, I'm thinking about you, who are saying, you know what, it's gone too far, forget about it. So restate the case for why we need these end of the year state exams. Anybody want to take that first?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I mean, we are the test case. I'm sorry. I was going to say I feel like I'm at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting where I have to say I'm David Driscoll. I'm responsible for having kids spend thousands of hours of testing. But clearly, we jumped to the front of the country because of MCAS. I mean, there was thankfully a lot of parts to it, and I do think that many of us need to keep faith with good and great teachers, by the way, and all of the comments that the teachers made are right. I mean, if PARCC and Smarter Balance or any assessment program doesn't account for growth in a fair way, then it's not worth it. If any test doesn't have someone mentioned that it was just raw data. MCAS not only was developed by classroom teachers, but we release the entire test, and we give you the right answers, and we tell you what standard it's related to. And when you get your multiple choice, not only do you get the right answer per classroom, so you know if there's a question on fractions, whether or not 40% of your kids got it right or 80%, we actually give you the raw data that tell you what wrong answer your kids gave, in case there's a pattern there. So all of the comments about the quality of the testing and the concern about PARCC and Smarter Balance, I think we addressed those through MCAS. So it was a very good test.
But to be clear, Dave, you did not give them the answers before the kids took the test.
No, we did not.
Okay, I just want to make
we
because that would explain a lot.
And we did what the Common Core does. We set very good standards, again, developed by our teachers. So I think, you set good standards. What is it the kids should know and be able to do? And then you have an assessment program that actually questions that and has ways of assessing it. So I think that's been fine. It's all of the politics. People mention the legislature in Indiana and so forth. I not only blame the current legislators who are running for cover, but I blame the states, many of the states that adopted, 46 states or whatever it was, that adopted Common Core. There was one state that adopted the new generation science standards the day after they were developed. So states just, without thinking, adopted the Common Core and weren't ready for this pushback. But anyway, to get back to your question, I mean, there's no question in my mind, and there's anecdotal evidence across the board as well as real evidence of how it improved student achievement in Massachusetts, and we really did jump to the front of the country where we had been 7th or 8th in NAEP, and we've been #1 since 2001.
Right. And it has not outlived its usefulness.
Not yet, but there's too much testing, by the way. We test too much, but we'll get back to that.
We'll get back to that. Okay. Celine or Andy, would either of you like to take this up? What the macro case, beyond anything Dave said, for the state testing, for the accountability?
Well, I think there's not a teacher in America who doesn't care about whether or not their students are learning. And so I think at some level, you know, what you heard from all of the teachers is I'd like to know where my kids are at the start of the year, and I'd like to know where they are at the end of the year. I wake up every morning motivated to help them succeed, and I want some indicator. There are multiple indicators that matter. One is, are they learning math and ELA?
Mm-hmm. But you don't have to necessarily attach all the stakes to that test that we are, right? So, I mean, where I'm going a little bit is to say, okay, we're not getting rid of the state assessments, yet everybody says we do like diagnostic assessments, right? But it can't be, it's not much use if you only do it once a year, right?
Well, and I think, you know, this goes back to where we were in Massachusetts relative to many other states around the country, you know, setting a very high bar, saying, you know, 10th grade students really need to pass something that's close to a 10th grade test, whereas other states kind of were saying 10th grade students need to pass something close to a 6th grade test. I don't think that's fair for kids. I don't think that is going to help us as a society. And so we need some kind of, you know, bar for, you know, so we don't fail kids and say at the time of college, now you need to pay for remediation and you can't start college coursework.
All right. Now, Andy, you know, some of what we heard in this panel and a lot of what we hear about testing now is the focus on teacher accountability, right? So we're tying these test scores to teacher evaluations. I mean, when you step back a little bit and you think about how everything's playing out in the reform circle, was that a mistake? I mean, do you think that we rushed into that in the reform community and that has warped the way that this whole thing is playing out now?
Well, I mean, you're almost asking down the vein of like, you know, do I still beat my wife? I mean, the answer to both those questions is yes. It's a very leading question. Yes, we rushed into it, and yes, it was necessary.
All right, but not on the wife.
No.
Okay, yes. Okay, Claudio's here from NPR. I just, you know, I just want to make sure. Plus,
Claudio's met my wife. You know, she'd be doing the beating. So both those things are true. And Bill Weatherby wrote a paper about this called The Hangover. But that's what happens. And you know, when you have these big policy shifts, you can write that. You could write that about welfare. You could have written that paper in the late '60s about the creation of Medicaid and Medicare entitlement programs. I mean, that to me is sort of an uninteresting question. The bigger question is how do you hold this labor force accountable in a meaningful way and so forth. And there's a lot of complexities there. I think what's going on here is, you know. So we can talk about Common Core and evaluation, and I actually think the subtext, this whole conversation we're having about Common Core in many ways, like in New York's a great example of this, it's really a conversation about teacher evaluation, right. And sort of it's getting battled out through Common Core, but what it's really about is this question of evaluation. Well, I mean, what you see, and you heard it on that first panel, which was just a great panel. I mean, teachers are understandably frustrated. They are in a low capacity system, and they're at the end of the chain, and so they're dealing with the consequences of that low capacity from the policy community, from you know, within school districts, and then within their schools. And one of the teachers said, you know, I want to teach rating, I want to teach at a high level, but you can have a school administration that's not interested in that, and you can teach at a very low level and still get where you want to go. I mean, those are all examples of a low capacity system, and so I think in the spirit of when we often in this field we talk about one thing when we're really talking about something else. When we talk about testing, what we really need to talk about is just the capacity of the system to do it right or to do it wrong. And we talk as if sort of testing is inherently going to have to be done wrong, as it is in some places. And then we leave out of the conversation, what can it look like when it's done right? And you heard the teachers on this panel, and what Celine just said, talk about how it helps their practice. Look at like an organization like ANET, which is a nonprofit that helps teachers use data and so forth. The teachers who work with them are very enthused in terms of how that helps their work. We've seen that in lots of places. David has examples from Massachusetts. And so the thing I loved about this report is it got us under this sort of averages and so forth, which obscures more than it reveals. And when we have we ask questions like the question you're asking, you can't ask these questions in sort of in generalities. You have to ask them in much more in specifics, because that's how this stuff plays out.
All right, so we're not going to get rid of state assessments. Okay, and you're pointing to things like ANET, these diagnostic benchmark assessments, formative assessments that people find in many ways very valuable, right? And there's some evidence that they actually can help raise achievement, right? Just the other day, Russ Whitehurst put out a post from Brookings saying we need more testing, not less testing, because it is the frequent assessment of students and then acting on that assessment that raises achievement. Okay, but again, it's those formative assessments that's driving those big numbers in some of your districts.
Well, with due respect, Mike, there's also evidence on sort of summative assessment and accountability, and it's relatively modest, but with due respect, it's not as modest as a lot of the ideas you guys tout around here. And, if you look at it in the context of sort of broad social policy change in the United States, sort of there's evidence that these tests and that kind of accountability for all their problems have also moved the needle.
No, absolutely. No argument from me there. But I do want to get back to the question about the formative assessments, because it seems like if you want to dramatically shrink time on testing, you'd get rid of those formative assessments. That's where most of the time is. But those are the tests teachers seem to like.
Yeah.
So how do you think about that?
I think that's true. I mean, what I was rejoicing about when we had the teacher panel was, in my view, what's happening today. It took a conversation about the quantity of testing to take that in some ways off the table to have a conversation about the quality of testing. The quality of testing is really the conversation that needs to be had, but in some ways we need to take off the table the quantity piece. And every time we tried to have a quality conversation to say, let's bring teachers to the table to talk about what features of assessments they want to see, people would say, well, there's just too much or there's not enough. And so I think what we've been able to do today, or what you saw the teachers do, is say it's actually not about how much time. Joy said, we gave 1 state test a year, now we're going to give 2. I'm psyched to give 2 because it actually gives me the data that I need. So I see a shift in the conversation that comes from saying, you know what, the average, the mean across 32 districts, and that's just a starting point, is not egregiously high. It gives us a marker for some districts where it is egregiously high, at least to say, let's reflect on what we're doing.
Okay.
But it advances a conversation that's more about quality.
So Dave, you said you think there's too much time testing. So is that including these formative assessments? Are we giving too many of these things?
Well, I was talking about the summative. Whether there's too much formative or not is another question. I think the real question is what's of quality and what's of value. And that gets lost in policy because things are very complicated, and yet state law and policy tends to be pretty simplistic. So we pass a 3rd grade guarantee, or whatever the hell that is. What's that mean? In LA now, all kids are going to be reading at the 3rd grade level. I mean, you don't pass it with monies for professional development. You don't pass it with monies so that kids can have lunches and breakfast and psychological services and so forth. So we're in this very simplistic age. And let me just quickly talk about summative assessment. In our state, we didn't have any state summative assessment. It was all local. And then our law said you'll test everybody in grades 4, 8, and 10. I amended that to be 4, 6, and 8 in math, 3, 5, 7 in language arts. And then, of course, the 10th grade test that Celine said you had to pass to get a high school diploma. That's a lot of testing on the state level. And as the teachers pointed out, from a practical point of view, you test little Johnny in the 4th grade, and his results come while the kid's in the 5th grade. So, what's the 5th grade teacher to do? What's the 4th grade teacher to do? But that was the system to at least get a sense. Along comes No Child Left Behind. It says you'll test everybody 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and once in high school. So it doubled our testing, and it doubled our testing time for summative assessment. And I think summative assessment is limited. So I think I think our panel is supposed to talk about the policy issues that need to come out of this. And I think there are 2. Number 1 is we have to look at the science. We always look at the art, never the science. So when you say formative assessments, I can say a lot of lousy formative assessments, and I can show you some good ones. What works and what's value for kids learning? And I think the more we shift to formative assessment, away from summative assessment, the better off we're going to be. And the second policy area is technology. I mean, there's a whole world out there. Never mind the issue that the teachers brought up, which is they don't have enough technology. Can you imagine any local bank or insurance company or large corporation standing in line waiting for, we have 1 computer for every 6 whatevers? I mean, come on. It's ridiculous. So if we could take advantage of the technology in a positive way, so I think that's what's missing. We had the debate about teaching to the test. Now, nobody worries about teaching to AP because it's good testing, right? But we worry about teaching to the test. So we have national debates about teaching to the test. MCAS caused teaching to the test. Well, that was a good thing, actually. So I think it's time to really look at true solutions and policies and a semblance of order. Right now, it's just knee-jerk. And we really are summatively testing way too much.
We're still talking about form. I mean, David made a really important point. A lot of what is masquerades under the name of being formative assessments these days is sort of really just mini summative assessments. And vendors put this on, districts want it, and so forth. And you really got to look at sort of what actually are these instruments, what are they being used for, and then what are teachers being given to be supported? Because a lot of times they're also administered, and then leave aside sort of how quickly you get the results, what kind of support are you getting in using them, and so forth. And those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking, not these broad sweep? Do we need summative versus formative? I mean, that's the kind of stuff. I mean, you can have a blog or a Twitter war about that, but it's meaningless in terms of actually designing a policy or supporting or figuring out how a district can better support its students.
But hold on, but it's
Andy, if the effort to have good national, state-led assessments like Park and Smarter Balance and others, really were serious about putting the money behind it from a scientific perspective and not having it done on the cheap, making Park and Smarter Balance and others just backing off to really where it's not going to be as effective a test, you might have seen formative assessment actually built into the summative, which is the way to go, right? I mean, you give the summative assessment, then you rely on NWEA or DIBELS or whatever. Wouldn't it be nice to have a semblance of board? I have a whole system, by the way, developed by teachers and vested by teachers and tested by teachers.
All right, well, let's pick that up. So that's right. That was originally the proposal for Park. They were going to have these assessments throughout the year, where they through something assessment through something. They were through something, and so it would have been a common assessment every couple of months, and then you would have rolled up the results into the summative. Great idea. Problem was, people figured out that, wow, that is really going to start to dictate the scope and sequence of what schools have to do. And that now starts to sound an awful lot like a national curriculum. And by the way, how does this work for charter schools, for example, that are supposed to have a lot of flexibility and freedom over how they teach? And suddenly they know, well, you got plenty of freedom, except 6 weeks from now you're going to be tested on these items. And so they backed off. So again, I mean, it seems like these are, I mean, you're right, Andy, but we still have choices to make. So let me ask this one question. So do you think, Dave and others, you say we're doing too much summative assessment. Should we back away from annual assessments? Do we no longer need to do annual assessments, and we can figure out a way to get the teacher value added stuff some other way?
So ask the first question. Why do we have summative assessment in the first place? I mean, there was a good reason. We didn't have good data on how things were happening at a state level. And by the way, this idea that we were going to then publish results on NAEP and run it alongside state results it took 10 years for the outrage. I mean, one state, will remain unnamed, had 88% of its fourth grade kids proficient in math, when NAEP said 12% were. So that's, it depends on the year. So that's, so summative assessment is a good thing because it suggests that we're going to find out how a state is doing, how a district is doing, how a school is doing. That's a good thing. I just think we need to now rethink it. Do we have to test every school every year? Yeah, there's scientific ways of making sure that you're getting your assessment without having to do all of this 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can do growth factors through things, but it takes the good science and technology, which we're not either willing to invest in or think through.
And it would take the Department of Education being willing to waive some of those key parts of No Child Left Behind to let people experiment. I mean, it's a very clear requirement. Wow, Dave, now you're talking crazy. You mean Congress would pass a law?
Well, they passed it in the first place. To double my testing.
You don't spend enough time in Washington, Dave. If you think they're going to get around to passing a law, that'd be crazy. No, you're right. They could pass a law.
So let me tell you about Washington. Back when President Bush got elected, the second Bush, all the stars were lined up, Ted Kennedy, John Boehner, whatever, and they passed a law. I mean, that was great, right? Everybody got along, so they passed a law. Well, that's the law we're suffering from. So having everybody agree on a law with all of its warts isn't necessarily worse than having a dysfunctional Washington. In fact, I kind of like it. They're not getting anything done. You can't bother.
You say you're not a big fan of the Farm Bill.
I'm not.
Look at that Farm Bill. There you go.
It depends on what they tucked in the Farm Bill. I haven't seen it all yet.
All right. Okay. The teachers, very spontaneously, we did not plant this. We're very positive about Common Core. Though we will be sharing that with our friends at the Gates Foundation at our next funding proposal. No, I'm just kidding. All right. But the question on the Common Core is this going to change everything? Is this finally going to get us to the point where the assessments, Park and Smarter Balance especially, are so much better than anything we've had before? It really is going to encourage the kind of teaching and learning that we all want to see in the classroom. I mean, are you still hopeful about that promise? Anybody?
Well, you mixed two things. You said Common Core and then you said the assessment. So the answer is certainly from my perspective, the Common Core is fine. writing the standards is not the hard part, although give them a lot of credit. It's implementing them. So that's the first issue. And then the assessments have to match. So it's complicated. One would hope that both assessments will be good and what other assessments tie to it. So yes, if we can develop good, strong standards finally to be used nationwide, and a good assessment with it, it will be a huge step forward. Absolutely. And I think it's encouraging, by the way, with all the foolish politics that goes on when you raise standards. People are against it for the craziest reasons. I love to watch CNN or one of these where they have some parent stand up and talk about the communistic aspects of it or whatever. And they haven't read them. They haven't read them. So I think that's the real damaging part of this whole debate. It's not about what the debate should be about.
So go ahead.
Can I just say real briefly, we, as I outlined at the beginning, have worked with teachers to kind of distill down 5 main points that we hear from teachers in terms of what they want in terms of test quality. And I think there's some hope and some remaining optimism that the Common Core assessments can still get us to that place. So alignment to curriculum. You would be appalled to hear how many teachers are still having to administer tests that have nothing to do with the curriculum they teach. Mm-hmm. That is a very fair frustration that should be addressed by this point. I think teachers are hopeful Common Core will address that. Measuring the ability of very high and very low below grade level students. There's hope there. Same with getting the results back more quickly, same with asking more complex questions and giving something to help you figure out how to improve from what you have. And so I think a lot of the hope that teachers have in Common Core and in the coming assessments is surrounded by will they address, and I'm hopeful that they will address, the things that I see as challenges now. And I hope that they will. When I hear things like the backing off on formative assessments, I would say, why can't we in a district look at, I think there's a district saying, both there's the, is this a national mandate and a national mandated scope and sequence? And there are also districts saying, I already give 25 hours of testing a year. I can't layer on more. Mm-hmm. But I would urge those districts to say, listen, pull together a group of teachers at each grade level, look at the actual assessments. I bet there are a lot of teachers, if the assessments are strong and formative assessments aligned to Parker Smarter Balanced, they would say, scrap the rest and go with that, because that's going to give me what I need to improve, and these are measuring the right things with the right types of higher order questions.
Yeah. So, Andy, this question about test prep. I think George Miller, I saw the other day, gave an interview, and he said he was surprised by what had happened under No Child Left Behind, all this focus on the test, and drill and kill. And we all know, nobody wanted that to happen. And we've all been in debates, and we've said, well, you can't blame the law for people behaving stupidly, and that's all true, but it's widespread, it appears. And it appears that a lot of schools out there reverted to that kind of fear-based, oh my God, we got to raise the scores, so we just have to double down on test prep.
Well, this is the problem, Mike. I mean, look, we can't even have an honest conversation about this stuff, the capacity in the system. And so you overlaid, and No Child Left Behind, for all the sort of hype about it, what Clinton did in '94 was like much more of a sea change, telling states to have standards. All we did in 2001 is tell them you actually got to make them meaningful and do something with them. There was an increase in testing, but it was really just about you're going to have to hold schools accountable, not just sort of on your own whim, but you actually have to set some targets and timelines and so forth. And what we quickly found out is the political system doesn't have the tensile strength to handle that. And we've seen that play out. This system is just not a system that really readily embraces accountability. And so play that forward to Common Core. What we've essentially said is, okay, these relatively modest state standards, which in most places were relatively modest, you couldn't even hold yourselves accountable for that. So now what we're going to do is have these new standards, which really are a sea change in terms of their expectations, what they expect from teachers, what they expect from students, and so forth. And somehow that's going to be widely embraced. I mean, it really is. It's like a couple that's like in a really terrible relationship that's not going well, and they say, you know what will make this relationship better? We should have a baby. That will help. This has immediately gone to like this exponentially more complicated level when we couldn't even handle the basic level. And so this is the teaching to the test. That is a low capacities systems response to heightened performance expectations. You're going to see the exact same thing with Common Core. if we don't get serious about talking about the capacity. And that's some hard conversations about instructional quality. It's some hard that people, on the left have trouble with. It's some hard conversations about resources and funding that people on the right have trouble with. And so I think if there's a reason to be worried about Common Core, it's not these episodic things like this three-ring circus in New York and so forth. It's this underlying problem of the political system just cannot bring itself to get serious about doing what it needs to really improve our schools. And that more than any of this temporal stuff is the real risk to Common Core.
But when you, fundamentally, when you talk about capacity, do you mean these schools, they feel the pressure and they literally do not know what to do? Like they don't have the expertise to respond in a more positive way.
There's a reason some schools don't turn testing into this be-all, end-all. They deliver high-quality instruction. They shave off the rough edges. And this is not like charter schools or private schools or public schools. There are schools in all sectors that do well with this. There are schools in all sectors that do terrible with this. There's a reason for that, and they tend to be high-capacity places. For one reason or another, they've been able to develop that. Low-capacity schools do this deadening stuff, and they stress out about it. All the things that drives you crazy as a parent, they're the stuff you see because they're worried about it. It's how they're acting. I mean, you go into schools where there's no consequences for the kids with the tests, just for the adults, and yet the kids are they're stressed out. They've got everybody wearing the same color T-shirt, all this kind of crap. I mean, that's how a low-capacity system responds to a challenge, and good schools just don't do this.
So, Mike, I totally agree. To me, I use the word distractions. Baby would be a hell of a distraction. It's distractions, right? We love distractions. I mean, you try not to go down a path of reform, and you can guarantee somebody has a distraction to throw at you. So I remember telling my secretary, boy, you better clear my schedule. When we jumped to first in the country, I said, they're going to be knocking down my door in these 49 other states to do what we did in Massachusetts. I didn't have a one. Because what we did, and it wasn't me, it was based on the leadership and the consistency, no distractions. So we're going to set high standards. We're going to let the teachers be involved. We're going to give them money. Remember, we had a lot of money thrown out there, a lot of money for professional development, a lot of money for teacher salaries, etc. And we're going to stick with it. And that's what we did, no distractions. So this issue of teaching to the test was just another distraction. That turned out not to be a huge case in Massachusetts because guess what? Those people that taught to the test didn't get the kind of sustained results. The ones that did, and of course we took all the schools that outperformed what you would expect, and most of them were in the urban areas. Bill Edgerly gave money, $10,000 of his own money to 10 schools. We had Vanguard schools, you remember, Celine. All of these schools that just knocked it out of the park, we went and said, are you teaching to the test? And the answer was no. We're understanding the standards, and we're incorporating them in what we're doing. And by the way, it's about engaged kids. And so good activities and so forth and so on. So I agree with Andy. We get all these sideshows. I mean, it's disgusting what's going on in all these states. It's a sideshow. It's a political sideshow. And I am so thrilled, and people ought to note that something like 70% of the teachers in America support the Common Core. And that's because good to great teachers don't mind good things being done as long as it's consistent. They don't mind being held accountable. And I'll use the example of, I don't worry about the growth. If you get growth, we have a system that'll say, you got growth, you got growth. What I worry about is little Johnny in your class, and it's mostly in urban areas, whose parents get divorced or who's whatever in September, and the kid goes for a dive. Now, is the teacher responsible for that? Well, over time, if we use the science and we stay and don't have the distraction, we can use it as one factor for teacher evaluation. But I agree with Andy. It's all the distractions. Can't we just draw it up and stick with it? No one ever does.
Well, David, you're pointing another. Oh, go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to kind of add to what you both said and say this kind of gets to one of the questions that we weren't able to answer and may build further research around, which is this question of prep and teaching to the test for how does that all play itself out? And we actually felt like we couldn't credibly measure it. We know that some teachers like some of the ones on the panel who talk about having a period every day to prep for tests. Like there's one side where you can say we spend tons of time on test prep, and it's easy to quantify from a teacher's point of view how much time I spend on test prep. Then we had teachers at the far other end of the spectrum. And when you ask the question, how much time does prep take? They say, well, 180 days all day. I teach. That prepares the kids for the test. And so we couldn't figure out how to credibly ask a question that actually got to, what is bad prep, in fact. Like when someone on the panel talked about learning keyboarding skills and learning to type, and, that actually is not a bad thing for a kid to learn. So what are the things that are distractions? What are the things that are just for the sake of test taking? That's the question that needs to get asked next. And we felt like it was so complex, and there's such a range of what exists out there, that all we could do was say, minute by minute, how long does it take you to give a test, and kind of surface the disparity between what district administrators were reporting and what teachers really experienced.
Yeah, so many good points. Dave, I do have to ask you one question. When you talk about, just staying focused and avoiding all these distractions, do you think the teacher evaluation stuff is a distraction, or is it the next logical step in the standards-based reform?
Well, all of these things have merit. Third grade guarantees have merit. It's just that they tend to become both victims of distractions and silver bullets. Quick fixes. We're going to get rid of all the teachers by, bad teachers by just having the system. So I think it's like everything else, Michael. If it was a thoughtful approach, as our whole law was, remember, our law wasn't just about testing and assessment. It had about standards and assessment, a whole series of things. I think if teacher evaluation was looked at holistically, and then you stay with it, then we'd be all right. But immediately people say, well, teacher's going to get fired because the kids didn't do well, and so forth and so on. Teacher evaluation is probably the worst part of human resources in all of. You talk to any teacher 5 years ago and ask how they get evaluated, and they're lucky if the principal comes in 20 minutes, so forth and so on. So it's an area that had to get addressed. 99% of teachers getting rated good or great in the country is ridiculous. So it had to get addressed. It's just that, again, we're not able to put a system in place and stick with it, with all of these variations that you need, and that just doesn't happen. It gets jerked around, and there's state laws come and so forth.
We should be careful, though. With the thing, the problem with the Massachusetts example is also Massachusetts started from a place with a pretty good public school system, a pretty good traditional public schools. There's very few states. You look at what happened in Massachusetts economically. There's very few states that have survived multiple industries leaving and have then been able to attract new industries. So like Michigan is trying to do this with one industry falling apart, whereas Massachusetts has been able to do it with textiles, they've been able to do it with manufacturing, and there's just a base there. And again, I'll use that word, capacity. And the problem, and David sort of got at it, that example of that student who's not doing well. In a rational system, you combine data with human judgment and so forth. In our system, it's very hard to do that. The unions are not sort of often left field when they say we don't trust managerial discretion because there's a lot of bad management. Like, that's actually a fairly defensible statement, right? So then we go and we then try to develop these metrics and so forth. They've got their own problems. And what we're dancing around the whole time is just a low capacity system. And so I think David's exactly right about how you need to do this, you need to stick with it, but you can only do that if you have a system that's got the ability to do these things.
But let's keep pushing on the low capacity piece. Okay, so what exactly does that mean then? What do we do to make it more likely that more schools out there will respond thoughtfully to the pressure from Common Core, for example? Is it money? Is it more training? It's sort of.
The problem is you do multiple things at once. You need to address the situation where you're meeting it. So policymakers need to be serious about how are you going to support teachers. What are you going to do with training, and more than just the train the trainers model and the stuff. How are you seriously going to provide this support? That means resources and so forth. And people like to talk about how much we spend, and we do spend a lot, but that money's tacked down. And so for a lot of these things, it just necessitates new resources just because of the way the money flows. So you have to do all those things. And then you'd also get serious about the pipeline. You'd say, what do we need to do to change the human capital pipeline? What do you need to do to really get serious about how we train credentialed teachers, school leaders, and so forth? And we don't, again, we dance around the margins of that. We don't do any of that. And honestly, just, we might as well be honest about it, in part because we have this terrible climate of intellectual McCarthyism in this field. And if you raise these issues, you just get attacked and you get browbeaten and so forth. And so people just sort of lay off. And it keeps us, we don't, in this field, talk honestly about some of the really serious core problem. We can't even talk about sort of data becomes personal. How can you say that if you're just looking at a data point's not a personal attack. A data point's a data point. And so we came into the field. It's a very unhealthy dialogue at a time when we need to be doing multiple things at once if we're going to be serious about doing this. And again, and what you're going to hear, I worry, in a few years, is what you heard on the first panel. The people who are actually in charge of implementing this policy, teachers, and you heard if they're involved in Teach Plus, these are exceptional teachers. You're going to hear their frustration. They've been put out there. They're dealing with all this dysfunction. They haven't been supported and so forth. We're going to hear the same thing about Common Core. The verbiage will be different, but you'll be hearing the same sort of frustrations and so forth play out.
So Celine, I mean, to put a more positive spin on it, I mean, when you go into schools that are working, that have this capacity, I mean, how has that come to be? Like when you find teachers that you work with that feel like their schools are really doing it. I mean, is it just the normal thing we always hear? They had a great leader, and
well, I think it's multiple layers. I think a great leader certainly helps. I think for the teacher community, I think there are ways to get the teacher community involved in some of this decision making that we see very rarely. That could happen much more. Teachers aren't psychometricians, but they absolutely, if you said to those indie teachers who have their I-STEP test that is failing them, here are some other examples of state tests. Here are both PARCC and SMART are balanced. Like, let's pull together a group of all of the third grade teachers in the city who are interested, or, a small subgroup, or however you want to do it, and say, let's actually let you, figure out which among these three, state level assessments can be given. They actually probably would have something tremendous to say, the right rationale, and be able to kind of make those links between what's been developed and what's going to make sense in their classroom. And so I feel like now is a really important moment to involve teachers and say, let's empower you in that decision making, and then on the back end hold you accountable. Say, you said smarter balanced was the best way for us to go, and we ditched the I-STEP and we didn't go PARCC and we went smarter balanced. And there were thousands of teachers involved in that decision, and a lead group of 25 teachers who led this transition and really analyzed the tests and what they mean for students. That's very possible, and we operate in a system right now that disenfranchises teachers and says, well, you're not a psychometrician, so you don't get to be in the conversation about assessment. And then, surprise, surprise, they're frustrated with the assessments that they give. Yeah. So there's a lot of bridging to be done there.
Yeah, and the same is true of teacher evaluation. I mean, I mentioned 99% of teachers are rated good or great. So the reaction was, well, we got to get rid of those bad teachers. We know there's all these bad teachers. We got to get rid of them. No one pays any attention to the role of the principal and whether they've been trained to truly evaluate, et cetera. That's a whole part of our really culture in public education, that they're just not trained. You'd ask any principal, they're not properly trained through their training program and so forth to be very good evaluators. I mean, one of the things that we did was adopt National Institute for School Leaders. We had 1,200 urban teachers taught. And I hope to think that many of them became good leaders and knew how to work with their staff. That's a huge missing piece across the country.
All right, we are going to get the audience in this in just a moment. So if you have a question, Claudio, always you, Claudio. Oh, sure. Hold the NPR rank again. I'm just kidding. But if anybody has a question, and also out there, please tweet your questions to the hashtag #TimeOnTesting. I am looking at them right now. By the way, you guys have provided some great fodder for Twitter. It has been going wild here, so good job with that. That is always a goal of ours, so appreciate that. Let me ask one last moderator question. It's something that we care a lot about here at Fordham, which is this question of reading, right? Again, get to the capacity. In the No Child Left Behind era, you could argue we've made pretty significant gains in math, certainly at 4th and 8th grade levels, and really in the era of test-based accountability, less so in reading. I mean, you can see some bumps for the lowest performing kids. That might be because of better teaching around decoding and things, but not much. And one theory, the sort of E.D. Hirsch theory, is that it is because we are not teaching young kids the content knowledge that they need for their reading comprehension. And many of us have been saying for years, the elementary school curriculum, we've got to bring back history and science and art and music and geography. And that's how the reading scores are going to be. But instead, we look at the school level and it appears that, if anything, they've just doubled down on the reading skills. So again, is this just a low capacity thing? And how do we solve this one? How do we just get this information out to schools that says teaching reading is teaching content?
So I hate to keep touting us, but we do lead the country for a reason.
Yes, Dave. All right.
You know,
Do you lead them by leaps and bounds or a few points?
Well,
Yeah, all right.
And by the
second
way,
only to Shanghai in 8th grade science.
there has been some plateauing since Dave Driscoll left this commission.
So, you know, again, talk about distractions. I mean, you know, all you have to do is have a food fight over phonics versus whole language, and on it goes. We did settle it in Massachusetts, and I think and thankfully a lot of states, Wisconsin, Connecticut, New Hampshire, North Carolina, a few others, have adopted our Foundations of Reading test. And if you unpack it, it will talk about the various elements of teaching reading, not from this political, ideological way, but looking at the context of both content and context and the skills needed and so forth. So I think it's an area that, again, science can play a role. What is it that kids need? There's been enough studies about the brain and other things as to how kids respond. So I just think this is another area of complete distraction. And if you want to start, grab our Foundations of Reading test and work backwards and develop a curriculum.
I don't think that's quite. I think, again, you get back to this capacity problem. I mean, I'm in the E.D. Hirsch camp. Like, I mean, and first of all, there was no golden era where kids were getting this in high poverty schools. There was music and art and geography, and then we came along and took it away, and we talk about it like that. And it's just a ridiculous way to talk about it. These schools have never been good at this, and what they're doing now is they're drilling down on these skills, and you're left asking, you know, what are these kids reading? If they're not reading about, if you're taking all these things off the table, they're not getting history, they're not getting English, not getting social studies, you know, they're not getting sports. So then what are they reading about? And what you actually see is they're reading really sanitized, you know, awful stuff. And so it's not surprising that it turns kids off from reading. But again, this is what low capacity schools do. Good schools and good teachers know how to address this. And we, you know, again, as you know, if you want a sort of a case study in our problem with political tensile strength, we had $1 billion program to help schools do this better, and you may have noticed it's not around anymore.
Yep. Okay, Claudio. Yes, and wait for the microphone and speak up so that we get you on the webcast.
Your thoughts about the future of NAEP in the post-Common Core world. Will it still be the gold standard? Will it still be used to essentially keep states honest about where they are?
Yeah, I mean, Dave, one way to cut time on testing is let's just get rid of the NAEP. I mean, come on. No?
So, first of all, it has to remain the gold standard. So whatever gets tested has to be of high quality. We, as you know, there's been some publicity about it, we've been caught up in the sequestration and so forth. We've had to make some adjustments to our schedule, not testing civics and so forth. A lot of people say, well, if the PARC and Smarter Balanced are successful, what do we need NAEP for? Well, I'll even concede that, although I think we're always going to be the independent verifier. Now, PARC and Smarter Balanced will only replace NAEP, even be considered to replace NAEP, if their results mirror state NAEP. So if 26% of kids are currently proficient in Illinois, and PARC says 45 are, it will lose credibility. So first of all, we're always going to be the independent verifier. Secondly, people forget what we do. We don't just do math and reading. We do civics and the arts and geography. And when we're starting a new TEL test. We provide a lot of information about background questions that are asked of kids. We provide long-term trend. And here's your lesson for today, folks, being an old math teacher. Simpson's paradox. Did you ever hear of it? So it says that all parts of the system rise, but the whole system doesn't rise. That's Simpson's paradox. And that's what's happened in America. Very interesting. We've been testing, and it's not 8th graders, it's 13-year-olds, interestingly, since 1972 in math and reading in America. And what we've learned is that all subgroups have gained. Blacks, Hispanics, everyone has gained. The problem is the gain for blacks and Hispanics, and blacks and Hispanics are now performing as whites did 20 years ago. There's some good news based in NAEP, by the way. The problem is 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, it was almost all white kids. So that high-performing population has shrunk. and the population, obviously, of Black and Hispanic has gotten much bigger. So you're getting growth, but from smaller, lower performing groups. That's the Simpsons paradox. That's the paradox.
And not at the 17-year-old level, unfortunately. Not as much.
That is correct.
Yep.
So I think NAEP will always be around, assuming Congress appropriates it, and our need is probably going to increase, not decrease.
Okay. Other questions on Twitter or here in person? Yes. Wait for the microphone, please. Keep it relatively short because we got some beer and wine over there.
All right. Well, I really agree with the thoughts that it takes high-capacity schools to use assessment thoughtfully. Can any of you, speak more to this idea of improving the human capital pipeline for teachers and school leaders?
Teach Plus.
Well, yeah, I will.
Nice one.
I will make a quick plug for our T3 program, which kind of fills a gap in the human capital pipeline. So we focus a lot on bringing great teachers into the profession. We focus a lot on pulling them out to become leaders. We focus very little on building a kind of career in teaching that allows a second stage for highly effective teachers. In our T3 program, we take teacher leaders at different grade levels and subjects and allow them to work with their peers to build the capacity of their peers. It's very much around standards and around assessments and looking at assessment data to refine practice. And so I think those kinds of things that kind of institutionally put a role for excellent teachers as leaders of their peers are an important kind of middle step.
Great. Andy, can I push on you a little bit more? It's really because of that zinger earlier about some of our ideas. No, but so it feels a little circular here. We say, okay, we're going to we need accountability because we have these bad schools and we need to hold them accountable. But the bad schools that don't have capacity are going to respond to accountability in not productive ways. So what we really need is more capacity. So why don't we just skip the accountability and just do capacity?
Because first of all, without the accountability, you know, pretty quickly your monkey's throwing darts and trying to figure out what schools and where to target your efforts. But I mean, the answer again, it gets back to this. There's got to be a give on the political right and the political left. It takes resources, but it takes resources to spend. We just spent $3.5 billion trying to turn around low-performing schools, and it turns out if you go into low-performing schools and you do stuff that's not really aggressive, they remain low-performing schools. You know, did we really need $3.5 billion to learn that lesson? Arguably not, but that was sort of the only way. No one was really willing to bite the bullet and say you could only get this money if you're doing really aggressive things. So we flirt around the edges with these things. We don't sort of take them head on. And I mean, to the earlier question about the human capital pipeline, I mean, can anyone honestly say, does anyone want to make the case in this room that we have an honest conversation in this country about teacher quality, about the quality of preparation institutions? I'm on the board of 2 ed schools. I'm not hostile to them, but we don't talk honestly about teacher preparation in this country and the quality. And so if anybody wants to make that case, the floor is yours. And if you want to really tackle this problem, we've got to start to be able to do that. And so, you know, capacity becomes the word we use. It's a euphemism. We got to be able to start actually talking about these problems. Or, as I said, we're going to be right back here. And so it's not. You're right. It ends up being circular, but it's not inherently circular. Mm-hmm. It's because of sort of our inability politically to take these issues on. And we shouldn't pick on education too much. It's not as if the political system's working well in all these other sectors, and we're the laggard. But you see it acutely here, given the need and so forth.
And look, and I think you could make a case. We definitely need the transparency. Whether we need these stakes and we're going to go through this thing where we're going to close down bad schools or maybe not. Or again, you don't want the monkeys throwing the darts. You don't want them trying to turn around bad schools.
What's the example where states have done this without pressure on them? I mean, what's the example of where states have actually really done anything for underserved kids without federal pressure on them?
Right. Okay. Question in the back. So, in terms of gotta get the mic.
Related to the high capacity schools, I was just wondering, the human capital is very important. By the way, in LA, we just started a Teach Prep working group, and I think that's a very big issue we have to start working on because our teacher preparation programs are cash cows, and we need to raise the bar. Common Core implementation is not going to be done unless there's coordination between universities and school districts. But anyways, getting back to my question, high capacity schools, I'm wondering if also social capital makes those schools, if that is a contributing factor to the reason why those schools are high capacity. I think human capital is important, but what about social capital?
Yep. Anybody?
Well, I think when you see, I think you're exactly right. The other thing we don't talk honestly in this country about is that different kids need different things. I mean, E.D. Hirsch talks that's sort of a core tenet if he talks about. Now we don't talk about that, and schools struggle with this, and you see this, and you see all kinds of ineffective programs that are kept around in the name of political correctness. You see people struggle with this. Another thing we don't do a good job on. So good schools realize that you're right. Social capital plays a role, but social capital is not an immutable fact of life, and there's things schools can do to level the playing field.
All right, one last question here from Twitter. Thank you. Caitlin Hannon says, I'm hearing a lot about state tests. What can districts do tomorrow to start to fix assessment? Any ideas concretely on what districts can do? Celine is free.
Well, my first one would be go to Assessment Advisor, and if you're looking for formative assessments, look at the way teachers have rated formative assessments and have conversations with teachers in your district.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts?
Well, just make sure that that you as a district understand what you want kids to know and be able to do. Your debate with Andy, I would cut you both in half.
Which half?
Well, I would cut your arguments. I would cut your arguments in half and then maybe cut them in half again. I think, for example, in Boston, as Celine well knows, Teach Plus had a role in this. The poorest performing school in Boston is now one of the highest performing, Orchard Gardens, and there's a whole story there. But that wasn't a case of pouring more money in or anything else. So there are these examples where capacity can be developed through good leadership, strong teachers, knowing where you want to go. So districts, that's a school that basically said, okay, these are the standards. We're gonna adopt them, and we're gonna just focus on them. So I think that's what a district has to do. Get with the game. Your job, whether the state screws up or not, is to see to it that as many kids as possible are getting where they need to get. So you do that through standards, knowing what you're doing.
Well,
go to work. Don't wait for the state, that's for sure.
One of those interesting parts of this interesting report was the gap between district-reported testing and teacher-reported testing. And I mean, a fundamental basic tenet, if you're going to have any kind of performance management, is you need to know what you're doing and why. And it's clear in a lot of places that even though the overall testing is less than you hear, they still don't know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so, like, if you're a school system leader, that's probably one of the first things you really need to get a handle on if you're going to tackle this problem.
That is all the time we have. Please join me in thanking our great panel and our panel of teachers earlier. Please do tell all your friends and colleagues that this video of this event will be online at edexcellence.net almost immediately. You can also go back and read all the Twitter action, which was kind of fun, at Time on Testing. And finally, on February 20th here at Fordham, we are going to have another panel on teacher quality, this one expanding access to great teachers. We're going to look at a recent report we came out with about right-sizing the classroom, how to take some of our best teachers and get them in front of more kids. Mike Hansen, Jean-Claude Brizard, Linda Donaldson, Guidi, Brian Hassel, be here February 20th. Thank you very much. And the reception starts now.